Yep, it looks like we are back at risk for false optimism from the Kremlin. There are two important news stories worth covering today, the first of which gives us all of the information that we need to anticipate what happened regarding the second. The important news story set up for Monday was supposed to be a phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, which might have given some insight into what will happen next with the war or a possible ceasefire. But it was a headline from Bloomberg that became what is worth centering today's discussion around. And it also opens up the possibility that Ukraine will be looking at the same set of circumstances that allowed Ukraine to go on the offensive in 2022 and recapture quite a bit of territory. So what I want to do is first go through what is in that article, and then tackle what happened during the phone call. I will specifically discuss the statements from Trump and Putin in that regard. Actually, you have been watching Putin talk to the press about it in the background, so you are already getting a sense of his sentiments. And now, as we transition into the unstructured portion of this conversation, it turns out there is only really one paragraph worth reading in that entire article. This is the meat of it. It says, Putin is confident that his forces can break through Ukraine's defenses by the end of the year, that means about 7 months or so, to take full control of 4 regions that he has claimed for Russia. That would be Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, the 4 that, by Russian Federation law, are supposed to be a part of the Russian Federation. And this is sourced according to a person familiar with the Russian president's thinking, who asked not to be named discussing private conversations. Well, whenever you're dealing with something in the national security domain, that last clause is going to be doing quite a bit of work. Let me read it to you again. According to a person familiar with the Russian president's thinking. That could range from someone actually inside of the Kremlin, who, for whatever reason, has decided that he or she wants to talk to Western media, even though if they were to ever be caught doing that, they would be in quite a bit of trouble. Alternatively, it could actually be someone inside of a Western intelligence organization, be it the United States, the United Kingdom, somewhere else in Europe, somewhere else, who knows. That would also qualify as someone who might be familiar with the Russian president's thinking if they are getting intelligence briefings that are well-sourced to the Kremlin. In other words, it's a bit of a game of telephone where the person who is sourced in this news article is getting his or her information from another step up, and it's filtering all the way through now to us having this conversation. Regardless of who the source is, that is quite a belief to have. We've talked about this in, I think, the most recent video on the main channel. This is the exchange of territory from the last few months of the war, going back, 7 months to October, noting that the April figure is not yet finalized and that could move up or down. And also, we have not yet seen May's figures. What we're seeing here, though, is, on the grand scheme of things, not much of an exchange of territory at all. The axis on the bottom shows us that in November of 2024, there was 600 square kilometers of territory that Russia gained in that particular month, which sounds like a lot, but on the grand scheme of things is not actually that much. I ran the numbers in that most recent video, and I said, let's just hypothetically assume that Russia is capable of continuing every month from now until some cut point of being able to get 600 square kilometers, the best that Russia has done in the recent months. What happens if you project that out? Well, it's somewhere in the realm of August to September of 2028 that Russia would actually be able to complete the entire capture of those 4 oblasts at that rate. And that has some heroic assumptions that I'll get to in a moment. My point is, though, just generally speaking, as a back-of-the-envelope calculation, based off of what we have been seeing recently in the war, getting to that goal, as Putin is suggesting he thinks is something that's feasible before the end of the year, that is years early from this perspective. Now, if you came to me retrospectively and asked me how this actually did happen, in other words, imagine that it is January 2026, and Russia indeed controls all 4 of those oblasts, and then you asked me, not knowing, perhaps I slept through the last 7 months, how it actually happened. How would I rationalize that having happened? I would probably say something along the lines of attritional warfare. And that's something that did appear multiple times in the comments section of the particular video that I've been referencing. So how that might come about could be something along the lines of Ukraine suffering a domino problem. In other words, Russia penetrates some Ukrainian defenses somewhere, and then is able to engage in maneuver warfare thereafter. A lot of what we're seeing and what's driving the data that you're still seeing on your screen now is the attritional process of fighting against lines, two sides, no man's land in the center. They're fighting, they're shooting each other, lots of people are dying, not much territory is being exchanged. If maybe Russia is able to penetrate part of the Ukrainian front line and get behind it, and then through rapid movements thereafter, acquire a lot more territory, causing further problems with further entrenchments that Ukraine has as the secondary entrenchments, that may be some plausible way that you could get to having Russia control all four of those oblasts by the end of the year. In other words, it would be something along the lines of seeing a repeat of Ukraine's 2022 offensives in the fall, especially in the Kharkiv region, where that's basically what happened. Ukraine got behind some Russian defensive lines. Russia didn't really understand what was going on and could not amount a good defensive stoppage to what Ukraine was doing with its offensive. And as a result, Ukraine captured way more territory than the scale on the screen currently can show. And really, that offensive only stopped because Ukraine's offensive stopped itself. Eventually, your supply lines are going to get really, really far, and the people actually executing the offensive are going to get tired. And that's what drove the stop of that offensive from Ukraine. But even so, I would still have many questions about how Russia captured so much territory in such a short period of time. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is a rough approximation of the line of control. And again, going north to south, the four oblasts in question are Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And I think it's worth spending a little bit of time discussing why it might be challenging to capture all of the territory in each of the four of those. Or at least three of them, because starting with Luhansk in the north, about 99 or more than 99% of Luhansk has already been captured by Russia. So if we're just projecting the current timeline that we saw just a second ago on the previous slide, it'd be very plausible to think that Russia captures 100% of Luhansk relatively soon. And in fact, Russia has pulled past the border between Luhansk and Kharkiv Oblast and is into Kharkiv Oblast along that particular front. Going to the next oblast south raises a couple of questions about what's actually happening with the battles in those regions on a day-to-day basis for an extended period of time that now goes on years. Think about the Battle of Bakhmut and the bloodbath that was, and also the Wagner mutiny that came out of it. Think about how long ago that was. Well, the next town over to the west of Bakhmut is Chasiv Yar, and the expectation was that as soon as Russia captured Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar would be the next thing in their crosshairs along that particular front. Well, the Battle of Bakhmut ended in May 2023, which means we are now 2 years removed from that endpoint. And it is still the case that after 2 years, Russia has not managed to fully capture Chasiv Yar. And that raises the question about if you are struggling for that long to do that, how is it that after the fact you're going to be able to capture all of the territory going further west to the boundary line of Donetsk? One thing worth pointing out here that does work in Russia's favor is that Chasiv Yar is the local high ground in the region. And if you fully control that, it will make fighting for the next parts of territory further west just a bit easier. But it's not going to be like the complete end of the situation from the Ukrainian perspective, because Russia is already getting some of those benefits in terms of being able to attack supply lines and other sorts of logistical hubs going a little bit further after westward from where Chasiv Yar is currently. And then going a little bit further south, where that last salient is forming there, that's Pokrovsk, which everyone was worried was going to fall many, many, many months ago, and is still holding on. Now, Russia has been able to leverage perhaps the presence of Pokrovsk and the necessary defense of it from the Ukrainian perspective to try to take more territory surrounding that area. But that is all captured in the territorial exchange data that we were looking at just a moment ago. It's still not the case that Russia is making substantial progress. It's making steady progress at high costs, but it's not the level of progress that you would need to be able to complete this process by the end of the year. Go yet further south, and you end up in Zaporizhia. If you take a look, there's a river that comes out of where that line of control is. That's the Dnipro River. Russia controls all of Zaporizhia south of that river. That's not the problem. The problem is getting further westward and getting lined up with the river. And the big issue that Russia would have trying to do that before the end of the year is that you can kind of see this right as that line of control is bordering up against the river. You can kind of see a little bit of gray there. That is where Zaporizhia city is. That's a large city that Russia would have to lay siege to. And laying siege to a city of that size is not an easy thing, and it's not the type of thing that takes a short period of time. Bakhmut, that was a small city. Pokrovsk, still relatively small again. Zaporizhia is huge by comparison, and if Russia is struggling to do this with the smaller cities, it's unclear how Russia is going to succeed with Zaporizhia in a short period of time, like 7 months. And then you go south one more time, and now the entire front line is represented by the Dnipro River. And for Russia to be able to capture the rest of Kherson Oblast on the other side of the river, Russia has to be able to stage some sort of cross-border raid that then expands itself into being something much, much larger without really functional bridges there to do that. Again, that's something that could plausibly happen, I suppose, but there are lots of question marks about how Russia manages to do that, short of Ukraine having some sort of catastrophic collapse in the integrity of its military forces. And one last point about the whole attritional warfare domino problem. I think part of that line of thinking is still reflecting an old school belief about how wars are fought. And I'm talking about just from a few years ago. I'm not talking about thinking back to World War I or World War II. I'm talking about the technological innovations that have come along with drones being a primary source of your military capacity in the current war between Ukraine and Russia. One way to think about how the war has been fought since Russia took the initiative, now more than a year ago, and has maintained the initiative ever since then, is that Russia is effectively trading lives for territory. It seems to be the case that Ukraine has a relatively favorable casualty ratio during this process. Ukraine is losing lives as well. Of course, it comes with the caveat that Ukraine has fewer people to work with, generally speaking. And so even if, hypothetically, you had a 2-to-1 casualty ratio in your favor, that might not be great in the long run from Ukraine's perspective, even if it is better than the alternative of a, say, 1-to-1 casualty ratio. I raise this point because Ukraine is using first-person drones to be able to substitute for your standard infantry. Ukraine is having a problem recruiting infantry for obvious reasons, and in the absence of having a whole bunch of men actually physically present on the front line, if you have a few steps back from the front line, an army of people wearing headsets and having first-person view drones scanning what's going on along the line of control, you're going to do a lot of the work that infantry would normally do in a war from, say, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. It's a replacement. It's a substitute. And that provides some level of reassurance from Ukraine's perspective, and raises a whole bunch of questions from our perspective as analysts about how Ukraine could suffer from a domino problem, which would then allow Russia in the attritional warfare setting to be able to suddenly and rapidly accumulate a bunch of territory in 7 months that it was struggling to be able to capture over the last year and a half plus. Anyway, this presents a problem for rapid acceleration in territorial gain, which again is why you see the small amounts of territory being gained over the last few months. Russia has to do something to remove the first-person view drone operators from the equation. There are basically two options for that. One, you remove the operators, or two, you remove the drones. Neither one of those is going to be easy. Let's start with the drones themselves. If you could destroy the drone manufacturers, you would be good. But the problem with that here is that the drone manufacturers in Ukraine are highly decentralized. There's a whole bunch of them scattered all across the country. So it's not like this is some sort of Manhattan Project where it's World War II, the United States is developing a nuclear weapon, and if you bomb a few sites, maybe one in Los Alamos, one in Washington, and one in Tennessee, suddenly the United States no longer has a nuclear program. That's not the case here. You destroy 3 drone factories, there's going to be a ton of other drone factories that will continue producing them. Okay, so the alternative is to go after the drone operators. They are going to be somewhat close to the front lines, but the problem is the entire reason why Ukraine is using these sorts of things is to keep them out of harm's way. It is also why Russia is suffering more casualties, because Russia is trying to physically advance forward, so that means men are moving, and they are exposed. The first-person view drone operators are far away, have the drones where the Russians are attacking from. It means the drones can hit the Russians, but the Russians can't hit the operators of the drones. They might be able to hit the drones themselves, but then the operators can take out another drone and get back to it. So this is unfavorable for Russia in terms of casualty exchanges, and it's not an easy solution to be able to disrupt the first-person view drone operators. Warfare, of course, is all about innovation, and especially as it relates to the operation of drones, there's been a ton of innovation and counter-innovation and counter-innovation and so forth. So if you want to try to explain retrospectively in January 2026 what happened over the last 7 months to allow Russia to be able to capture a whole bunch of territory, maybe the answer is that Russia came up with a really good solution to electronically jam the communications of the first-person view drones, thereby rendering them effectively inert and disrupting one of the main advantages that Ukraine currently has on the battlefield. But there's no real evidence that that has happened so far, and so we should hold off on thinking that maybe this is a plausible outcome to expect if you're trying to predict what's going to happen in the future rather than retrospectively knowing what has happened and trying to explain it after the fact. So, all told, if we are trying to understand what is going on with this thinking from Bloomberg, there are 3 options I could present you. First is that Russia has private information about what is happening either on the battlefield right now or what will be happening on the battlefield in the near future that leads Russia to be optimistic about what the territorial exchange is going to look like. So that could be something along the lines of, well, our people have figured out a great way to disrupt those drones, as we were just talking about a moment ago. And so once you apply that to what's happening on the battlefield today, it is reasonable to think that 7 months from now, we will have captured all 4 of those oblasts. The implication there is that if Russia is right, we will soon be seeing the consequences of this on the battlefield real soon, and we might need to update our own information about the accuracy of the information. On the other hand, it is also possible that there's an overestimation here, and as a consequence, you're going to see Russia trying to fight very hard, expecting to see good outcomes, and then, from the Russian perspective inside the Kremlin, be very disappointed when they're not actually coming to bear. The second possibility is that this is bad information. And I'm not talking about the communication from Bloomberg to whomever their source is. And I'm talking about the bad communication that could be happening inside of the Kremlin. Essentially a repeat of how we got here in the first place with the invasion in February of 2022. Where the information that Vladimir Putin was receiving on his desk in his daily reports was that this was going to go well and it was going to be relatively quick. We all know, of course, that the intelligence that was based on was incorrect, that Russia and Russia itself did not have a good understanding about what was going to happen with its own soldiers. The level of corruption and the level of preparedness of those soldiers were just not there to be able to conduct an operation that quickly to take over all of Ukraine, as well as some other issues with the intelligence about what Ukrainians were feeling about the situation and how much resistance Ukraine would put up. Now, to be clear, in the aftermath of the failed initial invasion, there was a lot of effort done inside of the Kremlin to root out those sorts of problems with corruption and principal agent problems and get better information filtering up to the desk of Vladimir Putin so the mistakes would not be repeated. Okay, so you're working against that possibility. But of course, to be fair again, the entire reason Russia was in this in the first place is that they tried to root out the corruption problem a long time ago. They thought that they had succeeded in doing it, and then they ultimately failed. So maybe what we're seeing here is that they put a bandage over the problem, and like any other bandage over time, the bandage is going to fall apart, and we're seeing a repeat of the problem as a consequence of that. If so, the implication here is going to be relatively beneficial from Ukraine's perspective, because Ukraine is not actually at any real risk of losing all of that territory in 7 months. However, it does mean that this is going to be a problem in trying to resolve the conflict, because Vladimir Putin is going to be obstinate in negotiations because he thinks things are going to go very well, And the only thing that's going to stop him from thinking that is observing what's happening on the battlefield, realizing that his assessment again was wrong, that he had been led astray by his advisors once again, and then updating his information because of that. And then maybe we get to a point down the road many months from now where Russia might be interested in relooking at those ceasefire negotiations. Another super important thing to keep in mind here is that part of the reason that Ukraine survived the initial invasion and drove Russia out of Kyiv is because of Russia's overconfidence in its ability to handle that situation. And it is possible that if this is indeed bad information, that mechanism number 2 is responsible for this report, then you could envision a situation where Russia starts going in guns a-blazing, trying to capture those 4 oblasts before the end of the year, but overexerts itself in the process. And so it is possible over the course of many months, Russia overexerts itself, and that ultimately causes Russia to lose the initiative, and then Ukraine, back on the offensive, winds up gaining lots of territory rather rapidly, again in a repeat of the saga that we saw in 2022. Now, to be clear, a lot of things would have to go Ukraine's way for that to end up happening, but it certainly is interesting that the prologue of the current situation matches the prologue of how the war started. Another thing that those first 2 options implicitly have in common is that the story as reported is accurate. Let's go to that first sentence there. Putin is confident that his forces can break through Ukraine's defenses by the end of the year. For both point 1 and point 2, it is the case, if that is what's driving this, that Putin is actually confident about that. Part 3, option 3 at the bottom there, however, is looking at this completely differently. That, in fact, Putin does not believe that, but rather this is a plant. And we could speculate a bunch of different reasons why it might have arisen in that way. But I think one clear one that's something that we should be talking about in connection to what else happened in the news on Monday is that this was a deliberate strategy by the Kremlin to try to convince the Western audiences that Putin is resolved in what's going to be happening on the battlefield. He is confident that he's going to be willing to fight for a long period of time because he thinks he can get a lot by doing that. And that might be informing President Trump what President Trump thinks he's going to be able to get out of Russia in negotiations, and perhaps affect his willingness to put up with ceasefire negotiations at all. This is one of those things that we as outsiders are not going to be able to parse out very well, because it's possible that someone inside of the United States already has this piece of intelligence. And of course, one of the ways that we talked about Bloomberg might have gotten a hold of this is through a U.S. intelligence official leaking it to Bloomberg. So it's possible that the United States already understands that this is going on, and the U.S. has its own assessment about whether it's accurate or not. Alternatively, it could be that this is brand new information, and so right now what we're seeing, or what we would be seeing inside of the halls of U.S. intelligence, is U.S. intelligence officials trying to figure this out literally right now as I am talking about it, and right now as you are listening to me talk about it. Very last thought here. There was another piece of news today that suggests that Russia might be serious in its thinking. Even if it's not ultimately correct in its thinking, it's still serious about thinking this way, and not having this be some sort of complicated bluff. Watch what countries do, right? Well, Russia, it appears, is amassing some sort of force along the Finnish border. This isn't at the level of us being afraid that Finland might be invaded anytime soon or anything like that. But it is the type of action that is a little bit weird to be doing while you're in the middle of another war going on in a different part of your country. So if we think that Russia is in fact confident about what's going on in Ukraine, that might open more resources to go elsewhere in the country and would help explain what's going on along the border with Finland. Either way, this is a good point to transition to the second topic of conversation for today, which itself was a conversation between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump via phone. This was supposed to lay the groundwork for a ceasefire or do something to that effect, although, as we will see in a moment, it didn't get very far. In the absence of an official readout, let's do the next best thing in the year of our Lord 2025, which is to look at social media posts. Here's Donald Trump's discussion of what happened on that phone call. Just completed my 2-hour call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. If we stop right there, this immediately reminds me of a couple of things. One is an episode of Black Mirror called The Entire History of You. The beginning of that episode features a conversation where an employer tells an employee, quote, "We really hope to look forward to seeing you again," end quote. And a recurring subject matter in that episode is the characters analyzing that phrase, "We really hope to look forward to seeing you again." Not, "We look forward to seeing you again." We really hope to look forward to seeing you again. The other thing that this reminds me of is a moment from one of the presidential debates when Donald Trump said that he had concepts of a plan. Not a plan, concepts of a plan. Well, it's similar here. We don't have discussions of a ceasefire. We have discussions of a ceasefire. We want to negotiate on how to negotiate, on how to negotiate, on how to negotiate. So you can see based on that just how far apart everyone is and the likelihood of something happening rapidly on this front. It's not very high. The next part is a little bit more interesting. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. Now, I need to caveat what I'm about to say next. There is seemingly an entire industry of online content creators, social media posters, whatever you want to call them, that will look at things that Donald Trump has either said or written, and then immediately extrapolate from that segment that this is official policy of the United States, or actually what Donald Trump himself thinks in a broader sense, and extrapolating beyond just those particular words. So that's a caveat that I'm going to put up front. But if we look at this, it says that the conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, between Ukraine and Russia. If you take that literally, which again, you should have a grain of salt before you do that, but if you take that literally, this is suggesting that perhaps the United States is not going to be the one that's making the demands on the table when you're having a negotiation between the two parties. That the United States might be switching its stance and taking a step back and having Russia and Ukraine take charge in the exchange of offers. I do not want to get bogged down in the technical details here, but effectively, if the United States is no longer going to act as a procedural mediator, that's not obviously a good thing in terms of trying to get a settlement. The reason being is that if you can control what two parties have as options and they can either accept it or reject it, then you can force the parties to reach some sort of compromise that might not be the type of offer that one party or the other would be wanting to make if they were endowed with the power on their own. Trying to get a little bit of intuition on that. If I have the sole power to make the proposals in a negotiation, then what I'm going to try to do with that offer is figure out a way to make my opponent just indifferent between accepting and rejecting that offer, so I can extract all of the surplus that comes along with reaching an agreement. And that gives me a strong incentive to be very aggressive in my demands in a way that is, again, trying to maximize my own welfare rather than trying to maximize the probability of peace. And in contrast, if you have a procedural mediator that is supposed to be the one that is making those demands to both parties, they're the ones that are putting the terms of a possible settlement on the table that the two parties can accept or reject. If the procedural mediator really just wants to maximize the probability of a peaceful agreement, then they are not going to be on the edge of what one party is willing to accept or reject. And that means that you have a higher degree of someone accepting or both parties accepting the deal. So again, if you want to overanalyze this, this is pushing the parties further away from reaching a settlement. Moving on, the tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. If it wasn't, I would say so now rather than later. It sounds like very much a Donald Trump tweet right now. Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over, and I agree. There is a tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth. Its potential is unlimited. I did a little bit of reading before recording this, and it seems that a common Western sentiment about this particular part of the post is very negative, and that this is providing Russia with a carrot that is detrimental either to the interests of a lot of people in the United States, but especially Ukraine. And while there is a world where that might be the case, the way that this is currently written, this is actually something that should provide Ukraine with extra bargaining leverage. Let me go through why it should provide Ukraine with extra bargaining leverage first, and then discuss how this could turn out to be very bad if it is not going to be followed the way it is currently written. If we go back to a classic lines on maps setting, the cost for war for Russia is the space between the white and the red lines. But remember that a cost for war is not just what you are paying by fighting. It's not just the people that are dying when you fight. It is not just the money that you are spending on your tanks when you go and start a war. It is also what you are losing by fighting the war. In other words, a benefit associated with peace that is lost if you fight a war is also a cost of war. And again, the larger those costs of war, the further the red line drifts east. The space between the white and the red lines is Russia's costs. The white line stays stationary because that is just the expected outcome. The red line will drift eastward, which means the set of settlements that Russia is willing to accept to end the war is going to increase in a way that is favorable from Ukraine's perspective. Okay, well, going back to the social media post, let's reread the important part. Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States, and this is the most important part here, when this catastrophic bloodbath is over, and I agree. When this catastrophic bloodbath is over. In other words, that is a benefit associated with the settlement. But from a lines on maps perspective, that is equivalent to saying that the cost of war for Russia is larger if suddenly there is going to be trade after the fact, after a war has been concluded between the United States and Russia. Well, that's beneficial for Ukraine in coercive bargaining with Russia because it expands the types of settlements that Russia is willing to accept. Now, there are a bunch of ethical concerns, and one practical concern that I'll get to in a moment, about having trade reestablished with Russia after the war ends. And this is a conversation that is happening both in the United States and inside of Europe. And regardless of what Donald Trump might want, even if a business has the opportunity to do business with Russia afterward, or with Russian companies afterward, because the United States has officially lifted sanctions, it might be the case that the business in the United States still doesn't want to do anything with Russia, because people in the United States are going to be upset with Russia because of these ethical concerns. And again, that's fine. There are ethical reasons why you might not want to trade with Russia after the war has ended. But, and this is the key thing, the ethical considerations there inescapably come at the cost of bargaining leverage that Ukraine could be leveraging over Russia in the meantime. That has been true since day one. And indeed, if you go back to the beginning of the war and you look at how the Biden administration first imposed sanctions on Russia, they bent over backward to emphasize the conditional nature of the sanctions. The sanctions were not some sort of blanket punishment against Vladimir Putin and against Russia. Rather, the sanctions were imposed because of the invasion, and if the invasion were to end, then the sanctions would go away. The reason that the Biden administration did this is for the reason that I just described, that unconditional sanctions provide no bargaining leverage for Ukraine in its negotiations with Russia. If you want to have a quid pro quo, then something has to be exchanged for something, and those two somethings are sanctions and invasion. Relief from sanctions for relief from invasion. In that light, the Trump policy as stated here is not that far away from what the Biden administration was previously employing, with one question mark there about how the Biden administration might have reacted to a ceasefire. How conditional would those sanctions have been? Would the Biden administration held out for Russia completely withdrawing from the territory that had been captured over the course of the invasion? Or would, for the sake of providing Ukraine some bargaining power in these negotiations right now, offer that as a carrot? That's hard to say because the Biden administration is no longer in power. The practical problem here is that if you are not careful in how you relax those sanctions, it could be that Russia is the disproportionate economic beneficiary of the relaxed sanctions. The United States is not getting much of an economic benefit. Russia is getting a ton of economic benefit, which means that Russia can turn those economic benefits into military power. And in the meantime, the United States is not getting much of an economic benefit, so the United States cannot do the same thing, and moreover, cannot take the benefits that it is getting and give them to Ukraine and allow Ukraine to, in some way, counterbalance Russia. That, again, though, is all conditional on this being a conditional promise, that the trade will only be reestablished following a ceasefire. If there were to be a world, and again, this is not what is currently being presented by the Trump administration, but it is something that I hear a lot of people in the West fearing. If there is a world where the United States relaxes the trade sanctions against Russia without there being some sort of settlement inside of Ukraine as it relates to the invasion, that is a big red flag. Ukraine would lose all of the bargaining power associated with conditional sanctions. And in the meantime, Russia would be able to take all of the economic gains associated with the deal, convert them into military power, and make things militarily worse for Ukraine on top of it all. That, to me, would be a major tripwire or a red flag. We've talked a bunch on this channel in the last few months that while there is certainly a transatlantic rift between the Trump administration and Europe, the extent of it is often overstated both in traditional media and on social media. And that if you actually look at the interactions that Trump and European leaders have, it's not as, say, cordial as it was during the Biden administration, but it's not the end of the world either. This, however, to me would be, again, the tripwire or the red flag that there is an unfixable transatlantic rift between the Trump administration and Europe at that point. That would be a signal that the United States is no longer indifferent in regard to European security affairs, but is willing to actively harm Europe as it relates to Russia. And that has all sorts of knock-on effects with how the international economy is going to function and trade relations with the United States, which is why this has not yet happened yet, and why, again, as it is written in that social media post, is that trade between the United States and Russia will happen when the bloodbath is over. So as much as I have tried to stress to Western audiences, don't panic. If that happens, that's the time to panic. The rest of this is not particularly interesting. Likewise, Ukraine can be a great beneficiary on trade capitalized for some reason. In the process of rebuilding its country also capitalized for some reason. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine will begin immediately. I have informed a whole bunch of Europeans. The Vatican, as represented by the Pope, this part's kind of interesting, has stated that it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. Let the process begin. We'll see how that goes. Actually, you know what? There's another red flag there. Imagine a world where Europe sees that there is going to be some sort of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine sponsored by the Vatican. It is not hard to believe that Europe might react to that by saying, hey, maybe that peace conference will have some sort of results, and we should wait to make any decisions about sanctions or armament packages until after that has been completed. That would be a huge mistake in terms of actually trying to leverage coercive bargaining power. If you want coercive bargaining power, you need to get those sanctions online as soon as you can and get the armaments ready to go and delivered as soon as you can, and then condition the end of those things with a deal being reached. You get Russia to the bargaining table and you coerce Russia by convincing Russia that your threats to do bad things to Russia are credible. And how do you make those things credible? You do them proactively, at least to some degree. Europe's not doing that, and if they keep holding back, they're going to lose further and further bargaining leverage and credibility with Russia. Meanwhile, and this is the last thing that we will do today, we have the comments from Vladimir Putin following the phone call that he gave to the media just outside. This is the official English translation from the Kremlin's website. Good evening. Our colleagues asked me to briefly comment on the outcome of my telephone conversation with the President of the United States. The conversation has effectively taken place and lasted more than 2 hours. I would like to emphasize that it was both substantive and quite candid. Overall, I believe it was a very productive exchange. Nothing really to comment on there. First and foremost, I expressed my gratitude to the President of the United States for the support provided by the United States in facilitating the resumption of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, aimed at potentially reaching a peace agreement and resuming the talks which, as we know, were thwarted by the Ukrainian side in 2022. A little bit of spiciness at the end there, and at the beginning, some of the buttering up to President Trump that we have seen Vladimir Putin do a very good job of over the last few months. The President of the United States shared his position on the cessation of hostilities and the prospects for a ceasefire. For my part, I noted that Russia also supports a peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis as well. What we need now is to identify the most effective ways toward achieving peace. Well, I'm not sure that is going to get very far until the United States actually puts forth some sort of conditional threats to Russia that the United States is willing to follow through on. And similarly, Europe starts taking proactive measures to coerce Russia in a similar way. And then, of course, we also have the first half of this video where you need to have some sort of convergence in the expectations of outcomes, which, if Bloomberg's report is accurate, we're not going to have anytime soon. He continues, "We agreed with the President of the United States that Russia would propose and is ready to engage with the Ukrainian side on drafting a memorandum regarding a potential future peace agreement." This is, again, we have a plan for a plan for a plan, rather than actually having a plan. This would include outlining a range of provisions, such as the principles for settlement, the time frame for a possible deal, and other matters, including a potential temporary ceasefire, should the necessary agreements be reached. Once more, we don't have a plan, we have concepts of a plan. Contacts among participants of the Istanbul meeting and talks have resumed, which gives reason to believe that we are on the right track overall. Well, that might actually be the first piece of new information here. I would like to reiterate that the conversation was highly constructive, and I assess it positively. The key issue, of course, is now for the Russian side and the Ukrainian side to show their firm commitment to peace and to forge a compromise that would be acceptable to all parties. Notably, Russia's position is clear. Eliminating the root causes of this crisis is what matters most to us. Well, given what that is code for, that effectively means the fall of Zelensky's government, so that's not going to be happening anytime soon, and that is an unreasonable demand to be making given the current military status on the ground. So this looks like we are not getting anywhere near an agreement once again. And then the rest of it is just some clerical stuff. So that's the perspective over from the Kremlin right now. And like I just concluded, it's not like this is going to result in a deal anytime soon. And now, for the 100th time, we sit back and wait to see if Donald Trump is going to be so fed up with the Kremlin that the United States will take costly actions that could actually coerce Russia. It hasn't happened 99 times before. We'll see if 100 is any different. And again, I think it is worth emphasizing here, the issue is not that the Trump administration is oblivious to Russia's tactics on trying to stall things out. That, I think, is way overdescribed in the media and in social posts online. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that the United States doesn't want to actually take actions that are costly and expensive and risky that might actually have an effect on trying to resolve the conflict. And that's why we are running in circles. If we want to run in circles in a different way, I could tell you about 2 fantastic books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.